If you guys are into Greek mythology, you must know about Sisyphus. He was the king of the Ephyra, and he cheated death itself. He cheated Thanatos, and because of his boldness and the sheer act of committing such sin, Hades condemned him to a punishment of rolling a boulder up the mountain only to watch it tumble back down and then doing it all over again. So you must have seen some sculptures like this where a man is pushing a boulder up a hill, up a cliff, and because of gravity, the boulder will roll back down. But the punishment of Sisyphus was to roll it back again and do it for eternity. This raises a question. Isn't that what we do on a daily basis? Every day we create something, yet there is something lurking around the corner. If you have watched The Cat and the Puss, you know what I mean. No matter what you do, no matter how much you achieve what you achieve, even if you think your name is set in stone, it will survive the test of times, it won't. But death will happen. And eventually it will all fade away. It's such an absurd thing, right? I sound like Camus. But then again, today we are going to talk about Camus and his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, where he boldly claims one must imagine Sisyphus to be happy. He boldly claims, but I agree. That's why I want to talk about it. Why must one imagine Sisyphus to be happy? And what does it entail? Condemned by gods to roll a boulder up the mountain and watch it as it tumbles back down to the plain, only to run back to it and do it all over again. Homer describes it as in the Odyssey. Odysseus sees him in Hades. With hands and feet, he's trained to push up the stone up the crest. But when it was on the very point of going over the top, the pitiless stone rolled back again to the plain. A torment, not of pain, but of futility. Yet Albert Camus, in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, says the struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus to be happy. Happy? With a burden that never ends? With a boulder that topples over just as soon as the task is about to be completed? How can a man be happy in the face of futility? Yes, Camus says, because the absurd cannot be avoided. We live in a world that offers no final answers, no ultimate meaning. Yet, within that absurdity, there is freedom. The gods gave Sisyphus a stone, but how he bears it, that belongs to him. Now, William James, the pragmatist, he writes, be not afraid of life. Believe that life is worth living, and your belief will help create the fact. I mean, pragmatists are also always very famous to latch onto the thought that makes living easier. They believe that a thought is valid as much as it has practical usage of it. You can say pragmatists are kind of practical philosophers, but philosophers that might be of actual use, because many people have said that if you're rich, you can afford to think about ideas. If you're not rich, you are bound to live life that is written in faith, where you labor over hours just to get enough food to survive. But a pragmatist is the exact workman who labor over hours just to get enough money to survive, yet can call himself a philosopher and have the liberty to think about ideas. James reminds us that meaning is not handed over to us by God, but it is something that we create for ourselves. From James' point of view, Sisyphus is not merely enduring his faith, he is creating value in each push that he is making. The very act of pushing the stone up the mountain can be an act signifying belief. But if we go over things such as literature, one of the most famous writer comes into mind, that is Shakespeare himself. In Macbeth, he writes, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying absolutely nothing. So he did lean more towards futility, yes, but he also said there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So, what Shakespeare is basically saying about Sisyphus is that it's not really a objective point of view of whether what Sisyphus is doing is fruitful or not, but it becomes a matter of perception of what you believe it to be, and that will become your reality. So we arrive at a paradox. Evidences pointing towards a certain thing, but the conclusion actually being something totally different than that. So even though one can say that these point of views that I enumerate in this video point towards different direction, but at the end, the act itself of pushing the boulder up the mountain becomes an act of defiance, an act of rebellion, something that Camus highlights a lot in his Myth of Sisyphus. Camus also writes, at each of those moments when he leaves the heights and gradually sink towards the layers of the gods, he's superior to his fate. He's stronger than his rocks. So why did I choose to talk about this to begin with? Our days are our boulders, and the boulders always roll back. The day ends, another day begins. But if we accept it, this is the way it is, then like Sisyphus, it doesn't become a punishment, but rather freedom. Some might even say that this point of view is more leaning towards stoicism, but even if that's the case, one must accept that if you rebel, if you're against the conditions that you can't change, like if you're against the entire dynamic of how the life goes on day after day, day repeats, and that is the thought that you're latching on to, you would be depressed in no time. And as Albert Camus discovers the point of suicide in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, you will understand what I'm talking about. If you try to change the inevitable, would you win? I don't know. If some miracle happens, maybe you're into that. Maybe you will be able to do that. But if you accept the fact that some things are just inevitable and they are bound to happen the way they are happening, and you choose to rise above it, instead of fighting that, you accept it and choose to do things differently, then that itself becomes an act of defiance. That itself becomes freedom. Because one must imagine Sisyphus happy. If you don't imagine Sisyphus happy, that means he's condemned for eternity. That is his punishment. But if he takes joy in it, if he's cheerful, as Shakespeare says, one must imagine in one's mind Sisyphus should be cheerful. One must imagine Sisyphus to be happy. So we live on every day imagining ourselves to be happy, or actually being happy for once. Even though any of the William Shakespeare is the only one I mentioned who is a writer. Other than that, William James and Camus are philosophers, more so than they are writers. They are thinkers. So Camus himself does not believe in the ontological argument. The ontological argument that higher being exists just because we can perceive the being through our intellect. So he doesn't believe in the ontological argument, but on our channel we have been very consistent with the idea of God. So if we look at Indian mythology, if we look at Krishna, he also said, Karm kareja, fal ki ichha mat kar. So, karm kareja, if we attach the idea of God to a person who is living his life, basically pushing the boulder every day up the mountain, thinking this is all futile, this is all ephemeral, it will end shortly. What's the point? What is the point? A pragmatist will here come in and accept the definition of God, accept the existence of God, just because people who live in the idea of God, in the belief of God, does so push that boulder every day, thinking the sheer act of work, calm, the sheer act of doing calm is devotion to their God. So they are happy because somewhere in their head they are devoting their actions, they're devoting their work to their God. So they are happy. One must imagine Sisyphus happy is something said by Camus, but it has already existed throughout centuries. and it has echoed throughout civilizations.